All right. Greetings for another week in the study in the Book of Esther. This week is week 4, and so as we spend some time together, this is intended to be kind of a replacement for our Wednesday night series since we're in the middle of some quarantining, and so we're trying to make the best of it. We are back in person on Sunday mornings for now, and so we're happy about that. So we're transitioning and doing an online Bible study instead of an online Sunday morning experience. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, that's why we've been releasing these on Wednesday nights and look a little different than they did for a while, but we hope that you're enjoying that. The Book of Esther is a wonderful book. Unique in many ways in the Bible in that the chief heroine is a lady by the name of Esther, after whom the book is named. And so as we go through and look at how she becomes the hero of her time, today's lesson focuses on two main attributes, character attributes. One that Esther exhibits, which is humility. We see that in the fasting. We see that in being willing to play a part in this big role. And then on the other side, in Haman, we see something we could call pride or vanity in some ways today. And we'll see some of that on exhibit in a few minutes. But then an old school word for that is vainglory. Okay, vainglory, glorifying the vain part of life instead of glorifying God. And so I want to dive into that. We're going to be reading a piece of each of the next 4 chapters because the story gets spread out a little bit. And so as we do that, I look forward to having some things online that you can see. Some verses will be on the screen for you, and hope you're able to read those at home. And so let's dive in. One more week in the Book of Esther, week 4. All right, so we'll be reading in just a few minutes from Esther chapter 5, and I'm happy to see the story get so much more exciting so quickly. And there's a few turns. If you're not familiar with the Book of Esther, I think you'll enjoy the drama of the next few chapters. So Esther chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, reads this way. On the third day of what? Well, that's the third day of fasting. Remember, she asked Mordecai to take all of the people he could ever get a hold of, all of the Jews who were on her side, and fast for 3 days. Even though God is not explicitly mentioned in that passage of fasting, it is certainly a biblical thing to fast before God, to humble yourself, lower yourself, place yourself at the feet of God and say, please interfere for us in this history, this moment of history. And so this is the connection to what she's doing there. So what we're going to do is see that on the third day, and I think always the number 3 is symbolic, 3 days in the belly of the whale for Jonah, 3 days in the grave for Jesus, but this time of preparation. And so Esther's not just, she'll go into the royal area and ask to be seen by the king. This is not on her behalf. This is not stepping above her place. This is something she does with a lot of the word would be trepidation, a lot of caution, a lot of, hey, I could get in big trouble for doing this. And so she put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. So the king is sitting in his throne room, and the queen asks to be admitted. When the king saw the queen standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, okay? And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Remember her being very afraid. If he had not held out that golden scepter, she would have been taken off and could have been killed that day. So then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther?" You remember she hadn't been around for 30 days. He hadn't seen her. "What is your request?" And this is how much she's gained favor with the king. "It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." Whatever you request, even half the kingdom. That's how much favor she had won in the courtroom, in the palace here in the throne room. And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." So she's there and she says, "Hey, if you want to do something for me, come to a feast that I'm planning." All right, so the king says to her, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast, verse 5, that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? And it shall be granted. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." So then Esther answered again, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them tomorrow. And tomorrow I will do as this king said." So she goes before the king. The king says, "Ask and it will be given to you, up to half of my kingdom," a very high favor for the queen. And she says, "Come to a feast." So they come to a feast, and he says, What do you want? He could tell she wants something. "What do you want?" And she said, "I'll tell you what, come to one more feast, and it'll just be three of us, you, me, and Haman. And tomorrow I'll tell you what I want." All right, so the king, and I think this is a brilliant move, the king doesn't know what she wants. Okay, and he's going to spend some time staying up awake at night wondering what in the world she wants. It's going to bother him, which I think is a brilliant kind of psychological move. And so here's the way it goes out. Haman, verse 9, goes out of that day joyful and glad of heart. Okay, so he's excited. Why is he excited? Well, the king has shown favor to him. He's been promoted. He's got the king's signet ring. He can do whatever he wants to. And now the queen has invited him to a feast. And so he thinks, wow, I'm highly favored. Look at me. And he begins to be prideful. And we see that really quickly. So Haman goes out that day joyful and glad of heart. But at the king's gate, he sees Mordecai, verse 9. And Mordecai, again, is not going to rise to show him respect. He's not going to tremble out of fear because he's not afraid of Haman. And so he's filled with wrath with Mordecai. And so verse 10 says, "Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them all the splendor of his riches." So one guy shows disrespect to Haman. Haman decides, well, I'm going to go home and I'm going to tell somebody how important I am, which is entirely prideful. Okay, so he recounts to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. So Haman says to the friends and wife that are gathered, even Queen Esther, "Let no one but me come to the king to the feast she prepared for the king. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king." So he's one of the three most important people at this story. And it's going to his head. So he's to tell everybody exactly what he's worth. And this is yet all of this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So he's one of the three most important, and yet this one guy's bothered him. That's Mordecai. Because Mordecai won't bow and show respect. Mordecai will not lower himself. Mordecai says, I bow before my God. You're no God. I'm not going to bow before you. The history we talked about between Mordecai and his ancestors, who would relate back to King Saul, and then Haman, who was an Agagite, and the king of Agag, and Saul went through this thing. And so there's a big history back there. You can go back to the previous episodes of this on YouTube and look and see those. So there's a history there, and he says, look, everything I have is worthless because I'm so filled with hatred in my heart to this one human being who won't bow. And so what comes out of that? Toward the end of the chapter, we see his wife Zeresh, all his friends, said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." The idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. All right, but then we see a plot twist, as it were. Okay, what happens next is very interesting. And what happens next, we have to interpret as the very intervention of God. Even though God's not mentioned, okay, the series of events makes it difficult for us to see anything but the involvement of God at this level. And it all has to do with timing. You have humble Esther and Mordecai coming before God asking for salvation for God's people. And then you have prideful Haman, who has set himself apart to be an enemy of God because he's attacked the people of God. I was reading today on Facebook, and I read a wise human being say that those who have set themselves against God to be the enemy of God are perhaps their own worst enemy. And so, wow, pretty wise words. So what does it mean to be the enemy of God? Well, full of pride perhaps is part of it. And It's not a great place to be. So where do we go from here? Let's continue reading. We'll just read the first part of chapter 6 and continue to tell the story. But the first part of chapter 6 is this big plot twist that we see. On that night, the king could not sleep. He gave orders. Why couldn't he sleep? I think he's staying awake wondering what the world Esther wants. Somebody called me on the phone and said, Pastor, can we meet sometime next week? And I say, yeah, what do you want to meet about? Oh, I'll tell you then. The whole time between now and then, I'm going to be wondering what in the world you want to talk to me about. Just tell me, right? So I don't have to worry about it. And it might be good and it might be bad. I don't know, but I'm worried about it. I'm curious about it. That's the way some of us roll. He says, on that night he couldn't sleep, so he gave orders to bring in the book of memorable deeds or chronicles, as it would have been, and they were read before the king. So somebody kept a book of all the important things that were happening. And the king said, tell me some of these things. I want to go back and I want to read the good stuff. Well, that's nice. And so it was found written, and he read for a while until he got to the place where Mordecai had told a couple of the people, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And so Mordecai finds out this plot to assassinate the king. He told the right people about it. These two were handled rather well. And so the king's wondering at this point, wait a minute, here's somebody who did something great for me. And Persian kings were known for quick and lavish praise, quick and lavish reward upon those with whom they were pleased. And so if you did something to help a Persian king, the story books are filled with times of they would generously reward that person for the help that they had offered. And so the king said, this is important. What honor and distinction had been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? And remember, Mordecai's a lowly guy hanging out at the king's gate every day, a Jew, an immigrant into that area, somebody who had been brought in terms of being a slave, did not have a high position, did not have a lot of influence, did not have a lot of these things. Where do you go from there? And so they said, what was done for this man? And accurately so, they told the king nothing had been done for him. And so the king says, okay, well, we're going to fix that. The turn of events is fun because he's looking for a way to reward Mordecai, and in comes Haman. And so Haman doesn't know that the king's been reading the history books. He doesn't know that Mordecai had done this nice thing and that the king now knows. He doesn't know that the king is looking for somebody some way to reward Mordecai. And so he asks, who in the world's out there in the court? Who's in yet? And a big achiever, overachiever, Haman's there. And so the king says, bring Haman in. So Haman comes in and the king says, how in the world should we treat somebody who has found my favor, who's done something good for me, and I want to return the favor? And Haman, it says out loud, if you read the rest of the chapter, thought to himself, and this is pride, this is vanity, who in the world would the king want to reward other than me? After all, I've been invited to this feast with the king. He doesn't know the queen wants to showcase his evil deeds before the king, but he's thinking, wow, everything is going my way. So he comes up with this big extravagant way of rewarding Haman. In fact, he thinks he's rewarding himself, but he says, oh, maybe king, if you had a robe that you wore, that'd be great. Put that on the person. And a horse that you rode, that'd be great. And then have somebody who's high up in the kingdom walk around pulling the horse and telling everybody, this will be done for you if you do something nice for the king, because this person is being rewarded. And so the king says, that's great. Go find Mordecai the Jew and do that with him. And don't leave anything out. I love that part. The king says, all the things you told me to do, don't leave anything out. So Mordecai spends the rest of that morning, Haman spends the rest of that morning dressing up Mordecai in the king's clothes, riding on the king's horse. And this was sometimes, especially with David and Solomon, if you read, there's a time when Solomon was walked through town in the king's horse, and that was symbolic of the fact that Solomon would be taking over. So Haman wanted that for himself. He ends up having to do that for Mordecai. I've got a picture that I found, and it's in the book that I've been looking at, but instead of taking a picture of the book, because that's not often the best, I found a picture on the internet, and I'll show that to you. It's interesting. We see on the left side of that picture, we see a portrayal of Haman carrying Mordecai around leading the horse. On the right side, we see something that's coming up next. I'll explain that probably next week. And so he's not happy. He goes home in mourning. He's covering his head, going through town. Oh, I got to get home, got to get home. He gets home, tells his wife what happens. And his wife comes up with a big warning. Hey, if this is what happens, if you've begun to fall before this guy already, he may take you out. And there's actually a prediction going back about his group of people losing to God's group of people, of course. And so we don't know that she knew that, but we know she's like, uh-oh, something bad's coming. You know, everything he set up, the gallows are built to hang this man, and it turns out during the night. So what does she perceive, perhaps? If not the timing of God, if not the intervention of God, not by name, but knowing something else is going on. The forces of history are against Haman in this moment. Even his wife calls it out, and those friends of his who are there. And so we move on a little bit, and we start reading in chapter 7. In chapter 7, we're back to the feast. The people come in to get Haman, and they bring him to the feast, and they set him down. And finally, after the feast, and they begin enjoying their beverages afterwards, which they were known to do, and which we read about them doing. Their glass of wine, they're drinking. The king and Haman went into the feast with queen on the second day. That was a long feast, right? As they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, and it will be fulfilled." And the queen said this, and it's very humbling. It's very much giving the king his due. She said, "If I found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be granted from me for my wish, and my people for my request. For I've been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." In other words, she said, we're getting ready to be killed and annihilated, to be destroyed. If we were going to be sold into slavery, that's not big enough to bother you, but being killed in and of itself is. And so the king Ahasuerus says to the queen, "Who is he? Who is this guy? Where is he? Who has dared to do this?" In other words, who's coming after the queen in my own castle? Who's going to do that? And the Esther said, "A foe and enemy." And that's what he was. He was a foe and enemy. Whenever you set yourselves against God, whenever you attack the things of God, whenever you attack the people of God, you become the enemy of God. And in that way, you've become your own worst enemy, and you're gonna die a death, because our God is greater and our God is higher. And so then she names him this wicked Haman. It said, then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then he was finally terrified. He's sitting there thinking, who in the world is this? Because remember, he doesn't know she's a Jew. He doesn't know she's a Jew. They hid it up till that moment. They don't know she's related to Mordecai. You can say, well, the deception's not worthy. The deception's something that God would not be proud of. And perhaps that's the case. But God uses that distinction to win the day for his people, to win the story of Esther, to win the story for Israel. And so then she said, if it please the king, and I found favor in his sight, and if the king seems right before the king, if this thing seems right, and I'm pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the provinces of the king. So what happens is, she says, Haman did it. It turns out I'm a Jew. And so immediately the king gets mad. Well, when he didn't know who the Jews were, it wasn't a big deal. And that's something that's very disturbing about King Xerxes. But now he realizes, wait a minute, the guy I honor today who saved my life is a Jew. My queen is a Jew. I need to protect these people. And here my right-hand man, turns out he's destroying everybody in my household who's trying to protect me and build me up and do great things for me. So Haman falls directly out of favor. The king's so mad, he walks away. He leaves the room, he goes out of the room, and Haman throws himself at the queen to beg for his life. Okay, when the king walks back in, Haman had thrown himself on the queen, and he thinks, oh man, this guy's trying to assault the queen. He wasn't, he was trying to beg for mercy. But the king says he's trying to assault the queen in my own presence, in my own throne room, in the room that we just ate at this feast. And so it's pretty detailed what happens at this moment. You go back and read the book. and read the whole chapter, it says they covered Haman's face at that moment. The people who were with the king, they grabbed Haman, they covered his face. That means the last thing Haman saw was the face of a Jew, and he was begging for his own life. The tables have turned. The plot against the people of God has failed. Not really even at this point, but the main proponent, the main enemy of God is getting ready to get his. So one of the guys in the room says, by the way, King Xerxes, you may not know this, but Haman built a gallows yesterday to hang Mordecai because he hates him so much. The Jew, by the way, who saved your life. And so King Xerxes says, let's hang him on that very same thing. So if they covered his face, it's very potentially they would have taken him straight for his execution. And what we would see is that the last thing he saw was Queen Esther. At least that seems to be the point of why else would they tell us that he covered his face at that very moment. And so Haman is executed. And then that's not the end of the story. We won't get into all of this today. We'll see a little bit of that, but then we'll get into the rest of the story tomorrow. And the drama leaves off in this way. The queen says, look, if there's any way possible, this edict has gone out to kill all my people. Would the king be willing to save my people and write another edict? And the king basically says, my edict can't be removed. It doesn't look good for the king to undo what the king did. But he does say this. The queen says, how can I bear to see the calamity that's coming to my people and bear to see the destruction? And so the king, Ahasuerus, says to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, he ends up giving Mordecai the signet ring that he took off Haman. Behold, I've given Esther the house of Haman. They've hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So he says it basically this way. You can't outdo this one, but you can write anything else you think will help your cause. And next week we'll see where that drama unfolds. Haman's out of the way, but this edict still stands that on this one particular day of the year, you can go and kill and annihilate and destroy all the Jews. And a lot of people want to do that because they're enemies. There's a long history of Israelites defeating other people. Let's say, for example, the Philistines and others. And then when Nebuchadnezzar came in and took over the Jews, they weren't the only ones, there were others. And so you have this melting pot of people who are the enemies of the people of God, and the people of God living in these same areas in Persia now. Used to be Babylon, and they're at each other. And so a lot of people saw killing the Jews as a good thing. Finally, we get to annihilate them. It's the same way Haman wanted them dead. What does God want? God wants to protect his people, and God wants to share this great story of salvation that'll be told for a long time. What do we want? What do we see in this story? What's the point that we need to be looking for? That's a very great question. Probably several things. Who do we thank in this story as having been the victor? Who do we give credit to? We might say, well, Esther and Mordecai, look how they acted. But if it had not been for the behind-the-scenes intervention of God and the timing of all of this, what do we mean by that? The lack of sleep from King Xerxes that led him to open the book. All of the pieces of timing, all the little things that we see are little things that we don't see in this life. God is at work, and sometimes we think if it's not an outright miracle that we see and everybody's like, oh, look, God did a miracle, that he's not at work. And the truth is he is at the work, but it's oftentimes behind the scenes Jesus, behind the scenes God. If Esther teaches us anything, it's that God is truly at work behind the scenes and to protect his people, to carry them forward and do all of those things. But I think if we're to look at also a very practical lesson for our life, what would it be? Why don't we very much look at the fact that we need to not be full of vanity and pride, and we do very much need to be filled with humility before God, beseeching God, wanting God to intervene, looking for God to intervene, and faithfulness to use whatever it is God has given us. We start at the beginning of the story, and the two people of least influence perhaps in the entire story were Mordecai and Esther. Look at the story now. Mordecai is going to be elevated to the role of Haman, so he's second in the kingdom. And then you have Queen in terms of influence over the king. The bottom two go to number 2 and 3. In fact, because they're the ones writing the edict, because they're the ones controlling, and the king has taken himself out of this. Perhaps they're 1 and 2. And why? Because God. No matter what the question is, God is always the answer. Well, let's look forward to next week. Well, the edict is still out there. We've got to see how all of that gets handled and what the results of that are. We'll see the interpretation of the second part of that painting next week too. And I look forward to having you join us for one more week. This was week 4. Join us next week for week 5 in the Book of Esther.